there's one thing we have learned in politics, particularly over the last few years, is that it's not enough for a policy to be popular in order for Congress to pass it. What you need is a billionaire on your side. Now, two academics have done a study of American politics and have come to this conclusion. We may be a democracy on paper that isn't what we have become in practice.
What is this thing we call democracy? Do the buildings of the national capital give the answer? National structures exist in other nations, but democracy is not architecture. Democracy lives in the lives of our people.
There are a few basic principles of democracy. One is that the will of the majority should determine what the government does, with some obvious restrictions. Today, that is not always the case. The will of the people has been tossed aside to make way for the will of an influential few. Here's an example. Last year, Senators Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey, a Democrat and a Republican, came up with legislation that would expand background checks and close loopholes in the current system. Most people thought this was a good idea.
90% of Americans, including a lot of gun owners, supported the idea of expanded background checks.
90% of Americans support universal checks.
88% of gun owners support background checks.
Democrats 95%, Republicans 87% in favor of background checks.
Background checks for people buying guns are among the most popular policies of any kind.
And even though the majority of people were behind the idea of background checks, an influential few were not.
The shooters in Aurora, the shooters in Newtown, they're unrecognizable. They're not going to be in the system. Who is going to be in the system? You and me.
Guess who won out in the end?
The gun control legislation that was supposed to tighten background checks was defeated today in the U.S. Senate.
The Manchin-Toomey amendment was defeated despite broad popular support. And a new study out of Princeton and Northwestern University could explain why. Two political scientists looked at almost 2,000 policy cases over 20 years, trying to answer some basic questions. Does public opinion translate into actual policy? And whose opinion matters? They found that average citizens' preferences have essentially zero estimated impact upon policy change. You heard that right. The average voter's opinion just doesn't matter. So what does? Major business interest groups like the gun lobby, and rich people. The researchers found that while the opinion of the average American has zero impact on policy, the opinions of economic elites have a very large, positive, independent impact. This is certainly not the democracy we learned about in school.
We're going to elect a president.
No more king. He's going to do what the people want.
No more king. We're going to run things our way.
In fact, it sounds like the textbook definition of oligarchy, or government by the few. So if the will of the people is not enough to get something popular like a background check bill passed, it's important to get a billionaire involved. Enter former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Yesterday, Bloomberg announced he'll be spending $50 million of his own money to build an organization to challenge the NRA and pursue an expansion of background checks.
This is not a battle of dollars. This is a battle for the hearts and minds of America so that we can protect our children, protect innocent people.
Because that's the way American politics works in 2014. If you want to get a broadly popular piece of legislation passed, you better find a billionaire, powerful business interest group, who agrees with you. Joining me now, political